If you love your son, don't walk into that ballroom yet. The stranger whispered to me in the parking garage on the morning of my son's wedding, and the way her voice trembled made my stomach tighten before I even understood why. I had arrived at the Grand Windsor Hotel just after 8 that morning, nearly 2 hours before the ceremony was supposed to begin. The early November air carried that damp chill Chicago always seemed to have before winter fully arrived, and a light drizzle tapped softly against the roof of my silver Buick as I sat for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. My reflection stared back at me faintly through the windshield. 68 years old. Silver hair carefully pinned beneath a pale blue fascinator. Pearl earrings my late husband Daniel had given me on our 35th anniversary. I had spent nearly an hour getting ready that morning because Brandon deserved a beautiful wedding day. My son had always loved elegant things even as a little boy. When he was 7, he once cried because the restaurant forgot to fold the napkins into swans at his birthday dinner. I smiled at the memory as I reached for the small white gift box resting on the passenger seat. Inside was Daniel's gold watch, the one Brandon used to sneak into our bedroom to admire when he was young. I wanted him to wear it on his wedding day. I wanted him to carry a small piece of his father with him as he started this new chapter of his life. The elevator doors near the garage entrance slid open with a metallic chime just as I stepped out of the car. A woman emerged quickly, almost stumbling in her heels. She looked to be around my age, maybe older, with damp blonde hair tucked hastily beneath a beige coat. Her mascara had smudged slightly beneath her eyes as though she'd been crying. At first I thought she might simply be another wedding guest running late. But then she stopped when she saw me. Really saw me. Her eyes moved over my dress, my corsage box, the small garment bag hanging in my backseat window. Then her expression changed into something I still struggle to describe. Pity perhaps. Or fear. She walked toward me before I could say a word. "You're Brandon Carter's mother, aren't you?" she asked quietly. I nodded, confused. "Yes. I'm Evelyn." The woman glanced nervously toward the elevator lobby behind her before lowering her voice. "Please," she said, gripping my wrist with cold fingers. "Don't go inside yet." I felt my heartbeat slow strangely, heavily, as though my body already understood danger before my mind could catch up. "I'm sorry," I said gently. "Do I know you?" She shook her head quickly. "No. But I know what they're planning in there." Her words settled over me like cold rain. Somewhere nearby, I could hear the distant rolling of luggage wheels against concrete, and the muffled sound of laughter drifting down from the hotel entrance above us. Everything around me still looked perfectly normal. Beautiful wedding guests, valet attendants, fresh flower arrangements being unloaded from a delivery van. Yet suddenly the parking garage felt darker somehow, quieter. The woman released my wrist slowly, her breathing uneven. "Your son doesn't know the truth yet," she whispered. "But if this wedding happens today, he'll lose far more than money." Before I could respond, the elevator doors opened again. 2 bridesmaids stepped out laughing loudly while checking their phones. By the time I looked back, the woman had already disappeared into the gray morning rain. For several seconds I remained standing beside my car, staring toward the elevator lobby where the woman had disappeared. The cold air slipped beneath my coat collar, but I barely noticed it anymore. Her words kept circling through my mind in slow, heavy waves. If this wedding happens today, he will lose far more than money. I looked down at the gold watch box still resting in my hands. Daniel used to tell me that instincts were gifts we ignored too often. He trusted silence more than charm. People reveal themselves eventually, he would say. You just have to stop talking long enough to see it. I finally inhaled slowly and walked toward the hotel entrance. The ballroom occupied the entire second floor of the Grand Windsor, and even before the elevator doors opened, I could smell fresh roses and polished wood. The wedding planner had transformed the space into something that looked almost unreal. White orchids hung from crystal stands nearly 6 feet tall. Candles flickered across mirrored tables. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers in the ceiling. Guests moved elegantly through the room carrying champagne flutes while waiters in black jackets adjusted silver trays filled with pastries and fruit. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. I stepped forward carefully, smoothing the front of my blue dress as several guests greeted me politely. Most of them smiled the way people do at funerals, warm on the surface, nervous underneath. "Evelyn, you look beautiful," Brandon's future mother-in-law said quickly before immediately turning away to speak to someone else. Another woman touched my arm lightly and said, "You must be so proud today," without fully meeting my eyes. It was subtle, small enough that another person might have ignored it. But by 68, a woman notices shifts in rooms the way sailors notice changes in weather. Something inside that ballroom felt arranged, controlled. I scanned the seating displays near the entrance while guests continued arriving behind me. A large gold sign read "Welcome to the wedding of Brandon and Lila" in elegant lettering. Beneath it sat rows of carefully printed place cards organized alphabetically. I found my name after only a few seconds. Evelyn Carter. Table 17. At first I simply stared at it. Then I checked again more slowly. Table 17 was not near the front beside Brandon's family. It was near the back corner of the ballroom close to the service hallway and kitchen doors. I felt a strange hollowness settle into my chest. Maybe it was temporary. Maybe there had been a mistake. I searched for another card. Mother of the groom. Family table. Anything. There was nothing. Just Evelyn Carter. Table 17. A young event coordinator approached beside me holding a clipboard against her chest. "Mrs. Carter?" she asked nervously. "Yes." She offered a tight smile. "The bride requested a slightly different seating arrangement this morning. I hope that is all right." I looked toward the head table across the ballroom. Brandon's seat stood directly beside Lila's beneath a massive arch of white roses. Every member of her family had seats nearby. Sisters, cousins, parents. Even an aunt from Arizona she barely tolerated had a place at the front. But me? I was seated beside strangers near the swinging kitchen doors. I smiled softly before answering. "Of course," I said. "Whatever makes the day easier for them." The coordinator visibly relaxed and hurried away. I remained standing there another moment listening to the muted clatter of dishes behind the service hallway. Every few seconds, the kitchen door swung open briefly before closing again. Waiters passed through carrying trays of champagne. Guests laughed beneath sparkling chandeliers. Somewhere across the ballroom, Lila appeared at the top of the staircase wearing a silk robe while photographers circled around her. She looked radiant, calm, perfectly composed. Then her eyes found mine across the crowded room. Her smile remained exactly the same, but something cold moved behind it for only a second before she turned away. For the next 20 minutes, I moved through the ballroom smiling at relatives I barely heard speaking to me. My body continued performing every polite motion automatically, while my thoughts remained trapped somewhere else entirely. I kept noticing details I probably would have ignored before. The way conversations softened whenever I approached. The way several members of Lila's family looked at me with uncomfortable sympathy instead of warmth. Even the photographers seemed strangely careful around me, as though someone had already warned them where not to point their cameras. I eventually slipped away toward the hallway leading to the restrooms, needing a moment alone from the noise and perfume and polished smiles filling the ballroom. The corridor was quieter there, lined with cream-colored wallpaper and brass sconces casting soft yellow light across the carpet. I stood near a tall window overlooking the rainy Chicago streets below, and pressed my fingertips lightly against the cool glass. Cars crawled through the wet morning traffic nearly 10 floors beneath me. Tiny, distant, simple. I envied them suddenly. "Mrs. Carter." The voice startled me enough that I turned sharply. It was her again. The woman from the parking garage stood several feet away near the restroom entrance, clutching a dark leather purse tightly against her side. Up close, she looked even more exhausted than before. Fine lines framed her eyes, and her hands shook slightly as she approached me. "I was hoping I would find you alone," she said quietly. I glanced down the hallway instinctively. "Who are you?" I asked. "And how do you know my son?" She hesitated before answering. "My name is Grace Holloway. I do not know Brandon personally." Her eyes lowered briefly. "But I know men like him. Kind men. Loyal men. Men who trust too easily." A strange heaviness settled into the silence between us. Somewhere nearby, I could hear distant laughter from the ballroom followed by the faint clinking of champagne glasses. Grace reached into her purse carefully and removed her phone. "I did not come here to ruin your son's wedding," she said. "I came because someone should tell him the truth before it is too late." She turned the screen toward me. At first, I only saw a paused video thumbnail taken inside what looked like the hotel lounge downstairs. Then she pressed play. The footage lasted less than 30 seconds. Lila sat at a corner table wearing a cream-colored coat with her hair pulled loosely over one shoulder. Across from her sat a dark-haired man in a charcoal suit. They were not touching. There was nothing romantic about the scene. If anything, it looked colder than that. Businesslike. Strategic. I watched as the man slid a folder across the table toward her. Lila opened it quickly before leaning closer. The hotel lounge music muffled most of their conversation, but one sentence came through clearly enough that I felt my chest tighten instantly. Once the marriage is finalized, access changes permanently, the man said. Lila smiled faintly before replying. Good. His mother still thinks she has influence over everything. The video ended. My reflection stared back at me briefly in the black screen before Grace lowered the phone again. I could not speak for several seconds. The hallway suddenly felt too warm. Too narrow. Where did you get this? I finally asked softly. Grace swallowed hard. Because the man she met last night used to be married to my daughter. I stared at her. She continued before I could interrupt. 3 years ago, that same man helped convince my daughter to transfer family assets into joint accounts. He disappeared 6 months later. Her voice trembled slightly now. Your future daughter-in-law has been connected to him for almost a year. I felt something inside me shift quietly then. Not panic. Not rage. Something colder. The kind of understanding that arrives slowly before settling permanently into your bones. At the far end of the hallway, the ballroom doors opened again. Music drifted outward along with bright, cheerful voices. Somewhere inside that beautiful room, my son was probably smiling right now, adjusting his tie, believing he was about to begin the happiest day of his life. After Grace walked away again, I remained alone in the hallway for a long time, pretending to study the rain outside the hotel windows, while memories quietly rearranged themselves inside my mind. It is strange how the truth changes old moments. Tiny things that once seemed harmless suddenly sharpen into something else entirely. Looking back, I realized the distance between Brandon and me had not happened all at once. It had happened slowly, politely, carefully, like furniture being moved inch by inch across a room until one day everything feels unfamiliar. The first Christmas after Brandon met Lila, they arrived nearly 3 hours late to dinner. Brandon had apologized immediately, carrying expensive bakery boxes and smiling like a guilty little boy. But Lila only glanced around my dining room before saying, "Oh, I thought there would be more people." I remember laughing softly to ease the awkwardness. Daniel had squeezed my hand beneath the table that night because he sensed it too. The judgment. The disappointment hidden beneath her perfect smile. After Daniel passed away 2 years later, things changed more quickly. Brandon still called every Sunday at first. Then every other Sunday. Then whenever he had time. Lila always seemed to have a reason. They were traveling, hosting friends, busy with work, remodeling the condo, planning something. There was always something. I told myself that was normal. Sons grow older. Lives become crowded. Mothers learn to step back quietly. But now, standing in that hallway outside my son's wedding ballroom, old moments returned to me one after another with painful clarity. The Thanksgiving dinner where Lila had rearranged the seating chart and placed me beside her coworker from dental school instead of beside Brandon. The weekend trip to Napa Valley where everyone posted photos online, while I only learned about it afterward from Brandon's cousin. The birthday dinner last spring where Lila laughed lightly and said, "Older people really do not like trying new restaurants, do they?" After I suggested someplace simple and quiet. None of those moments had seemed large enough to confront directly. That was what made them dangerous. Each one small enough to dismiss, small enough to survive. But together they formed something colder, intentional. I suddenly remembered another conversation from nearly 8 months earlier. Brandon and I had been sitting on my back porch during one of those unusually warm April evenings Chicago sometimes gets before spring fully settles in. He looked exhausted that night. Older somehow. We were drinking coffee while traffic hummed softly several streets away. "Lila thinks I should simplify things financially after the wedding," he had said carefully. "Make things cleaner." I remember smiling faintly. Cleaner usually means someone else controls the paperwork. Brandon laughed then, but not naturally. You sound like Dad. At the time I thought nothing of it. Daniel had always handled investments carefully. Trusts, property taxes, retirement accounts. He believed money should protect family, not divide it. Before he died, he placed nearly everything into structures designed to prevent manipulation or impulsive decisions. Brandon inherited comfortably, but not recklessly. There were safeguards, waiting periods, oversight. Daniel trusted our son completely. He simply did not trust the people who might someday surround him. A sharp burst of laughter suddenly echoed down the hallway, pulling me back into the present. Several bridesmaids passed nearby carrying garment bags and makeup cases while discussing flower arrangements. One of them glanced toward me briefly before lowering her voice. They disappeared around the corner almost immediately afterward. I stood there motionless beside the window, listening to the fading sound of their heels against marble floors. Then my phone vibrated softly inside my purse. A message from Brandon appeared on the screen. "Mom, where are you? Everyone keeps asking for you." I stared at those words for several seconds before typing my reply. "Just getting some air, sweetheart. I will be inside soon." My thumb hovered over the send button longer than it should have. Because for the first time in my life, I was no longer certain walking back into that ballroom would protect my son at all. The ballroom had grown louder by the time I returned, filled now with the polished energy that always comes before important ceremonies. Servers moved quickly between tables adjusting silverware and replacing half-empty champagne glasses, while guests gathered near the floral arch waiting for the processional to begin. I walked slowly toward table 17, keeping my posture straight even as something heavy settled deeper inside me with every passing minute. The table sat exactly where I feared it would, near the service entrance, half hidden behind a massive decorative arrangement of white roses and eucalyptus branches. Every few moments, the kitchen door swung open beside it with bursts of noise and steam before closing again. I placed my purse carefully onto the chair and looked around at the other guests assigned there. A distant cousin from Lila's side of the family, an elderly couple I did not recognize, a former coworker of Brandon's who spent most of his time checking sports scores on his phone. Not family, not even close to family. I smiled politely and sat down anyway. Years ago, humiliation like this would have hurt me immediately. But age changes certain things. You stop reacting to insults themselves and begin paying attention to the intention behind them. That is where the real truth lies. Across the ballroom, I spotted Brandon speaking with several groomsmen near the bar. He looked handsome in his black tuxedo, though there were shadows beneath his eyes that makeup could not fully hide. For a brief moment he looked toward me and smiled warmly. My chest tightened. He had no idea. None at all. A waitress appeared beside our table carrying a tray of champagne flutes. As she leaned down to place one near my seat, she hesitated slightly. "Mrs. Carter," she whispered softly. I looked up. She glanced nervously toward the ballroom entrance before slipping a folded linen cocktail napkin onto the table beside my purse. Then she walked away immediately without another word. My pulse slowed. Carefully, without drawing attention, I unfolded the napkin beneath the table. Room 1812. Bridal suite. 20 minutes before ceremony. The handwriting was hurried but unmistakably feminine. I stared at the words for several seconds while voices and laughter blurred around me. Then I slowly folded the napkin again and slipped it into my purse beside Daniel's watch box. Upstairs, the hotel hallways were almost silent compared to the ballroom below. Thick carpet softened every footstep as I followed the signs toward the bridal suites. The entire floor smelled faintly of roses, hairspray, and expensive perfume. Halfway down the corridor, I heard distant laughter coming from one of the rooms, followed by the sharp click of a camera shutter. Bridesmaids, makeup artists, wedding photographers, everything still moving according to schedule. Room 1812 sat near the end of the hallway. The door remained slightly open, just enough to reveal a narrow strip of warm golden light across the carpet outside. I approached slowly, my fingertips cold against the leather strap of my purse. Then I heard Lila's voice inside. Calm, focused. "No," she said quietly. "Once the paperwork updates after the honeymoon, she cannot interfere anymore." Silence followed briefly. Then another voice answered. Male. Low. Unfamiliar. And Brandon. Lila laughed softly under her breath. Not lovingly. Not nervously. Patiently. Brandon still thinks this is about building a future together. Something inside me became very still then. I did not move closer. I did not burst into the room. I simply stood outside that half-open door listening to the soft rustle of fabric and papers moving across a table somewhere inside the suite. After a moment, footsteps approached from deeper within the room. I stepped backward instinctively just before the door opened wider. A dark-haired man in a charcoal suit emerged holding a slim black portfolio beneath one arm. He stopped immediately when he saw me standing there. For one brief second, surprise flashed across his face before disappearing completely. Then he smiled politely like a businessman leaving an ordinary meeting. "Mrs. Carter," he said calmly, as though we had already met. "You should probably get downstairs soon. The ceremony starts in less than 30 minutes. For a moment, neither of us moved in that quiet hotel hallway. The man stood only a few feet away holding his black portfolio calmly against his side, while soft wedding music drifted faintly upward from the ballroom below. He looked polished in the way expensive lawyers and financial consultants often do. Perfect tie. Perfect posture. Empty eyes. I noticed immediately that he was not nervous. That was the part that unsettled me most. People doing something innocent usually explain themselves quickly. This man simply watched me with professional patience, as though waiting to see how much I already knew. "Do I know you?" I asked quietly. His smile barely shifted. "I work with estate restructuring," he replied smoothly. "Lila asked me to review a few post-marriage financial updates." Estate restructuring. Such clean words for something that suddenly felt deeply unclean. Behind him, inside the suite, I heard movement again. A drawer closing. High heels against marble flooring. Then Lila appeared in the doorway wearing a white silk robe with delicate embroidery across the sleeves. Her makeup looked flawless beneath the warm lighting. Her expression did not. For the briefest second, real shock crossed her face when she saw me standing there beside the man. Then it vanished completely beneath practiced sweetness. "Evelyn," she said softly. "I was wondering where you disappeared to." I looked at her carefully. Really looked at her. It struck me then how little I actually knew about the woman my son was about to marry. I knew her preferences. French champagne. White orchids. Boutique hotels. Cashmere sweaters. I knew she hated fluorescent lighting and always requested window tables at restaurants. But I did not know her heart. I was no longer sure Brandon did either. "I think your guest was just leaving," I said calmly. The man gave a polite nod before walking past me toward the elevators without another word. I watched him disappear down the hallway. Lila folded her arms loosely across herself afterward, though her smile remained perfectly in place. "Wedding mornings are chaotic," she said lightly. "There are contracts and vendor payments happening everywhere." "Of course," I replied. Silence settled between us briefly. Somewhere farther down the corridor, a photographer laughed loudly while directing bridesmaids into position for pictures. Lila stepped closer to me then, lowering her voice slightly. "Brandon has enough stress today already," she said. "I really hope nothing unnecessary distracts him before the ceremony." The sentence sounded gentle on the surface. Concerned. Loving even. But beneath it sat something else entirely. A warning wrapped in politeness. I held her gaze for several seconds before smiling faintly. "You should finish getting ready," I said. "Everyone downstairs is waiting for you." Her shoulders relaxed almost immediately. She thought I would stay quiet. That realization became painfully clear in her eyes. She touched my arm lightly as though we were sharing some private understanding between women. "Thank you, Evelyn," she whispered. Then she closed the suite door softly behind her. I stood alone in the hallway afterward, staring at the gold room numbers mounted against the cream-colored wall. My pulse had finally steadied again. But something deeper inside me had changed permanently. The confusion was gone now. In its place sat certainty. Slow. Cold. Complete. I walked toward the elevators without rushing. Inside the mirrored elevator walls, my reflection looked older somehow than it had that morning. Not weaker. Just awake. Daniel used to say that betrayal rarely arrives screaming through the front door. Most of the time, It sits quietly at your dinner table for years waiting for the right moment to take everything. When the elevator doors opened downstairs, I found Grace waiting near the entrance to the ballroom beside a large arrangement of white lilies. She looked anxious the moment she saw me approach. "Well," she whispered carefully. I adjusted the pearl bracelet around my wrist before answering. "You were right," I said softly. Grace lowered her eyes briefly like someone mourning something she already expected to lose. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Across the ballroom, guests had already begun taking their seats while soft violin music floated through the chandeliers overhead. Brandon stood near the altar now beside his groomsmen, smiling nervously as he adjusted his cufflinks. "My little boy. My only child." I looked at him for a long moment before finally answering her question. "I am going to make sure my son survives this day with his dignity still intact." The ceremony began exactly at 11 o'clock. Soft violin music floated through the ballroom, while nearly 200 guests turned toward the grand staircase waiting for Lila to appear. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above the crowd, reflecting warm golden light across polished glassware and white floral arrangements so tall they nearly touched the ceiling. From a distance, it looked like the kind of wedding people saved photographs of for decades. Elegant, expensive, perfect. I sat quietly at table 17 with my hands folded in my lap while servers closed the ballroom doors behind the last arriving guests. The kitchen door swung open beside me every few minutes carrying bursts of heat, and the smell of roasted garlic and butter into the room before shutting again. No one at my table spoke much anymore. Everyone seemed focused on the aisle, focused on beauty, focused on performance. Brandon stood beneath the floral arch at the front of the ballroom beside his best man, adjusting his cufflinks again and again without realizing he was doing it. Even from across the room, I could see the tension behind his smile. My son had always done that when anxious. As a child, he twisted the sleeves of his sweaters before piano recitals. At 16, he checked the knot of his tie 12 times before homecoming. Some things never leave us completely. The officiant smiled warmly toward the crowd as the music swelled louder. Then the ballroom doors opened. Every guest turned at once. Lila stepped into the room slowly beside her father wearing a fitted white gown covered in delicate lace embroidery that shimmered beneath the chandeliers. Gasps moved softly through the audience. Cameras flashed immediately. She looked breathtaking. That was the difficult part about women like Lila. They often do. She moved gracefully down the aisle with practiced calm while guests smiled and dabbed tears from their eyes. Brandon looked overwhelmed the moment he saw her. His entire face softened with love so openly that I had to lower my eyes briefly just to steady myself. Across the ballroom near the side entrance, I noticed Grace standing partially hidden beside one of the marble columns. She wore the same beige coat from the parking garage, though now her expression looked almost sorrowful. Our eyes met briefly. She gave the smallest shake of her head, as though still hoping somehow this ceremony could be stopped before it crossed a point of no return. Then I noticed something else. The dark-haired man from upstairs had entered quietly through a side door near the back of the ballroom. He did not sit with the guests. Instead, he remained standing near the hotel staff corridor with his phone in one hand, watching the ceremony carefully. Every few minutes, another staff member approached him briefly before hurrying away again. A wedding planner handed him a folder at one point. He barely glanced at it before returning his attention toward the altar. My stomach tightened slowly. This was no longer just suspicion. Too many pieces fit together now with terrifying precision. Lila finally reached the altar and took Brandon's hands gently in hers while guests smiled around them. The officiant began speaking about love and partnership and building a future together. The kind of words people always use because they sound beautiful inside rooms filled with flowers and candlelight. But as I watched Lila standing there beneath the white roses, another memory returned to me suddenly. 3 months earlier, during a family dinner, Brandon had excused himself to answer a work call outside the restaurant. The moment he walked away, Lila leaned toward one of her bridesmaids and laughed quietly. "Once we are married," she had said, "I am simplifying his entire life." At the time, everyone laughed lightly as though she meant organizing closets or combining calendars. But now, sitting alone beside the kitchen doors while my son prepared to pledge his life to her, I finally understood what she had really meant. The officiant smiled warmly at the couple before asking everyone to rise for the vows. Chairs shifted softly across the ballroom floor as guests stood together. I remained seated for one extra second, staring at Brandon beneath the chandelier light while Daniel's gold watch rested heavily inside my purse beside the folded cocktail napkin, and the terrible truth that now belonged to me alone. Everyone in the ballroom stood as the officiant began reading the vows, but I could barely hear his words anymore. My attention remained fixed on Brandon, on the hopeful expression in his eyes as he looked at the woman standing across from him beneath thousands of dollars worth of white flowers and candlelight. My son looked exactly like his father on our wedding day. Trusting, certain, completely unaware that love can sometimes arrive wearing a mask so beautiful people mistake it for destiny. The officiant smiled warmly toward the guests before turning to Brandon. "Marriage is built on honesty," he said gently, "on trust, transparency, and the promise to walk beside one another with open hearts." The sentence settled into the room heavily for me. Honesty, transparency. I slowly reached into my purse and wrapped my fingers around Daniel's gold watch box. Beside it rested my phone, the folded cocktail napkin, and the terrible understanding I could no longer carry silently. Across the ballroom, I noticed the dark-haired man checking his watch near the side entrance again. Calm, waiting, as though everything was unfolding precisely according to schedule. Lila squeezed Brandon's hand softly and smiled up at him with practiced emotion shimmering in her eyes. Several guests near the front dabbed tears from their cheeks. Cameras continued flashing gently around the ballroom. The officiant turned toward Brandon again. "Do you, Brandon Carter, take Lila Monroe to be your lawful wife?" Brandon inhaled shakily, smiling through nervous emotion. "I do." Applause and soft laughter moved through the guests. Then the officiant turned toward Lila. "And do you, Lila Monroe, take Brandon Carter to be your lawful husband?" Before she could answer, I stood up. The movement itself was quiet, small. But in a silent ballroom, even small things become impossible to ignore. Chairs creaked softly as several guests turned toward me. Lila's smile faltered almost invisibly. Brandon looked confused at first. "Mom?" he asked gently. My voice remained calm when I answered. "I am sorry, sweetheart," I said softly. "But before this continues, there is something you deserve to see." The ballroom became completely silent. Even the musicians lowered their instruments uncertainly. Lila released Brandon's hand slowly before turning toward me with careful composure. "Evelyn," she said lightly, almost laughing, "this really is not the moment." I met her gaze steadily. "Actually," I replied, "I believe this is the exact moment." The dark-haired man near the entrance straightened immediately. I noticed him reaching for his phone. Grace stepped forward from beside the marble column at nearly the same time, her face pale but determined. Brandon looked between all of us now, confusion hardening slowly into concern. "Mom," he said again, quieter this time, "what is happening?" I walked forward carefully from table 17 toward the altar. Every heel step against the ballroom floor sounded unnaturally loud beneath the chandeliers. No one moved. No one spoke. I stopped directly in front of my son and handed him my phone first. On the screen sat the paused hotel lounge video Grace had shown me earlier that morning. Brandon frowned slightly before pressing play. I watched his expression change second by second as the conversation unfolded on screen. The folder sliding across the table. The discussion about access changing permanently after marriage. Lila's voice calmly saying his mother would no longer have influence over anything. The silence afterward felt endless. Brandon lowered the phone slowly without looking up. "Lila?" he asked quietly. She laughed once beneath her breath, though the sound carried no warmth anymore. "This is ridiculous," she said quickly. "Someone is manipulating things to embarrass me." I reached into my purse again then and removed the folded cocktail napkin along with several printed documents Grace had helped me obtain downstairs only minutes earlier from the hotel's business center. Prenup amendments, financial restructuring drafts, property access revisions prepared less than 48 hours before the wedding. Brandon stared at the pages in stunned silence while guests around us whispered softly behind trembling champagne glasses. Then I placed Daniel's gold watch into my son's hand. "Your father spent his entire life protecting this family," I said softly. I could not stand here and watch you walk blindly into something built on deception. Lila's expression finally cracked completely then. Not sadness. Not heartbreak. Anger. For several seconds after I finished speaking, no one in the ballroom moved at all. The chandeliers continued glowing warmly above us while soft candlelight flickered across hundreds of stunned faces frozen in silence. Somewhere near the back of the room, a champagne glass tipped over onto a tablecloth, but even that small sound seemed strangely distant compared to the silence spreading between Brandon and Lila at the altar. Brandon stared down at the documents in his hands, as though he no longer recognized the world standing around him. His face had lost all color. Slowly, he lifted his eyes toward Lila. "Tell me this is not true," he said quietly. Not angry. Not loud. Just broken. Lila inhaled sharply before forcing another composed smile toward the guests surrounding us. "Brandon, please," she said softly. "Your mother is twisting private financial conversations into something ugly because she has never accepted me." I watched her carefully then. Even now, she still believed she could control the room if she remained calm enough, beautiful enough. But something had shifted already. Guests who once admired her now looked uncertain, suspicious. Several bridesmaids stood whispering anxiously together near the front row, while the officiant quietly stepped backward out of the center of the scene altogether. Brandon looked back down at the phone again and replayed part of the video silently. His jaw tightened slowly as he listened to her voice discussing influence and post-marriage access with cold precision. Then he noticed something else inside the paperwork. I saw the exact moment it happened. His eyes stopped moving across the page. "You changed the trust amendment date," he said quietly. Lila's expression hardened almost invisibly. "That was only because your attorney delayed the original filing," she answered quickly. Brandon looked at her for a very long time after that. 10 years earlier, after Daniel died unexpectedly from a heart attack, Brandon had stood beside me in our quiet kitchen holding his father's old coffee mug, while promising he would always protect our family the way Daniel had protected us. Looking at him now beneath those wedding flowers, I realized he finally understood what protection actually required. Sometimes love means refusing to look away. He removed the wedding ring slowly from his finger before speaking again. "You were planning this long before today, were you not?" Lila's eyes flashed with anger immediately. "Oh, for God's sake, Brandon," she snapped quietly. "Do not act naive. Everyone protects themselves financially." A sharp murmur moved through the guests. Brandon flinched as though she had struck something inside him far deeper than pride. Then, without another word, he placed the ring carefully onto the officiant's open Bible and stepped away from the altar. The entire ballroom seemed to exhale at once. Lila stared after him in disbelief. "Brandon," she called sharply, "if you walk away right now, you are making the biggest mistake of your life." He stopped briefly near the front row before turning back toward her. His expression no longer looked confused, only exhausted. "No," he said softly. "I think I almost made it." Then he walked down the aisle alone. Guests moved aside quietly to let him pass. No one clapped. No one spoke. Even the musicians remained frozen with their instruments lowered in stunned silence. I stood still near the altar watching my son disappear through the ballroom doors while rain continued falling softly against the tall hotel windows beyond the chandeliers. Beside me, Grace lowered her eyes and quietly wiped tears from her cheeks. Lila remained standing beneath the white roses, breathing hard through clenched composure, while photographers slowly lowered their cameras one by one. The beautiful performance had finally ended. 3 weeks later, Brandon came to my house early on a Sunday morning carrying a paper bag filled with coffee and fresh cinnamon rolls from the bakery Daniel used to love. The November trees outside my kitchen window had turned nearly bare by then, their branches dark against the pale Chicago sky. Brandon looked older sitting across from me at the breakfast table. Sadder too, but lighter somehow. Like a man who had finally escaped a room he did not realize was slowly closing around him. He turned Daniel's gold watch carefully in his hands for a long moment before fastening it quietly around his wrist. "I should have listened sooner," he admitted softly. I reached across the table and covered his hand gently with mine. "No," I said. "You listened exactly when you were ready to hear the truth." Outside, cold wind scattered leaves across the empty street while sunlight slowly pushed through the clouds above the neighborhood. And as I sat there watching my son breathe peacefully for the first time in months, I realized something painful but necessary. The cruelest betrayals do not begin with shouting. They begin the moment someone quietly starts removing you from your own family, while smiling directly at your face.